Greetings, I'm Brother Judah from the Congregation of Israel, a representative of the NMP, the Nazarene Messianic Party. And I'm your host today, and I'd like to welcome you all to What Is to Be Done. And here on this podcast, we investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. We approach the Bible from a social political perspective, and we argue this is the appropriate way to approach the Bible because the Bible deals with kingdoms and nations and societies and civilizations. In short, it deals with politics and political science. So today we want to investigate a debate that was held on Jason Whitlock's channel. And this is a debate between Delano Squires and Chad O. Jackson. We want to investigate this because I think this will also support some of our arguments about the race doctrine, where we keep explaining to people it's not about race. Race is messy. You can have a person of your same race, but you are diametrically opposed to each other. You can have one of your same of a different race where you are in solidarity and unity with each other. So it's our values, the fundamental principles in which we live and stand. This is what will determine unity and solidarity among people. Now, Chad O. Jackson and Delano Squires, they're going to represent two sides of the coin. And their argument is addressing the civil rights movement and MLK. Delano Squires is going to represent the pro side of the civil rights movement and Dr. MLK. And Chad O. Jackson will take the negative, and he's going to argue against it. If you want to view and listen to the entire debate, most high willing, it will be in the description box. Our focus in this session, which is likely to be a series of discussions on this subject, our focus will be with the argument of Chad O. Jackson. Now, we're going to let them both give the introduction, but we will critique Chad O. Jackson's arguments first. All right, this is our goal in the beginning. We're not really going to address Delano Squires, even though there's some things that I will agree with and some things I will disagree with. And it's the same thing with Chad O. Jackson. So let us look into this and begin a critique was being brought to the table. And we're arguing that Chad O. Jackson is actually a representative of the property class or the bourgeoisie. And he is going to be presenting bourgeois libel of the civil rights movement. This is the same argument that Philip Randolph argued, that the West was using libel against the Soviets. And libel is making reference to a defamation or a statement or a representation of defamation, to defame and discredit. And so Chad O. Jackson is going to use the same, pretty much the same talking points, pure old bourgeois arguments against the civil rights movement and MLK. Old arguments that was actually used against the USSR. And Chad O. Jackson immediately will bring in the USSR to show the USSR connection with the civil rights movement. Now we're going to look at that. However, the difference we may have with a lot of others who listen is that we're not approaching this argument that the USSR is something bad. And for those who are, you need to question why. A lot of people who believe the USSR is bad, the majority of the people that I have run into and heard concerning the USSR, if they read anything at all, it was from secondary sources, very little primary sources. In other words, they never really read the actual writings of Lenin or the actual writings of Stalin or the actual writings of Marx or the actual writings of Mao and thus and such. They normally respond off commentary, someone else's arguments and interpretation of primary sources. And so this is a mistake. But nevertheless, this is where the debate starts. Automatically is already set in stone that there's something wrong with the USSR. So therefore, there's something wrong with the civil rights movement. We're going to show you that's the premise itself, the foundations is off. All right. Now let us go. We're gonna if you want the listen to the entire debate without interruption, most high willing, the link to Mr. Jason Whitlock, the link to the debate and his channel will be in the description box. Let us get into this debate here and let them introduce themselves.
I still have a dream.
And Chad's response is, well, of course you would say that. He's a Marxist.
In fact, he slept with 2 women who weren't his wife the night before he died.
That one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed.
The issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution.
That's part of what we do. We air our grievances.
Free at last! Free at last! Thank God Almighty, we are free at last!
Welcome to the Harmony Channel. I am Jason Whitlock, your host. Happy MLK Day to those who celebrate. It is Martin Luther King Jr. Day across America. We wanted to have a special conversation about Dr. King's legacy because it is now being questioned. Is it a force for good, force for bad? Is it necessary? And so I've invited 2 guys familiar to my audience, Delano Squires and Chad O. Jackson, to have a conversation with me today about MLK, his legacy, his importance to American history. Was he a force for good? Was he a force for bad? Delano will argue the pro-MLK side. Chad, who's got his own documentary on MLK, will argue the anti-MLK side. But before we get into this debate, which I'm really looking forward to and hope that you all enjoy, I'm hoping that maybe there will be schools or young people that watch this discussion and learn from this discussion. But before, I'll let these guys introduce themselves, give you a little bit about their qualifications, why they're qualified to participate in this debate, and tell you a little bit about themselves. Delano, get us started. Introduce yourself.
Well, again, Delano Squires, been a long-time contributor to The Blaze. I have been writing on issues around race and culture for quite some time. Actually, I wrote a piece last year for The Blaze on MLK. Actually, I've written 2 pieces on MLK for The Blaze. And in addition to that, I write a fair amount about sort of the future of Black America. My focus is typically on the family, but I do see some linkages between what has gone on in the past and what lies in front of us in the future. So I'm excited about this. I'm looking forward to this debate and looking forward to chopping it up with Chad.
Delano, you just left out, you work for the Heritage Foundation.
That is true. Sorry. I'm the director for the Center for Human Flourishing at the Heritage Foundation.
All right. Chad O. Jackson, a plumber and a historian.
Yeah. So I'm Chad Jackson, as Jason just mentioned. I am the owner of a plumbing company out of Dallas, Texas, also a documentary filmmaker. Right now we're doing a docuseries on MLK called the MLK Project. This topic is something that I've been researching for years. And in fact, the film company that I own and operate, Historia Revelata, basically seeks to go back into history and to really look at the facts of what we have on hand and to try to recontextualize it for the preservation of Western civilization, quite frankly. So I'm excited to get into this debate. I'm a huge admirer of Delano's work. He's a prolific writer on family issues. And so, yeah, I'm really ready to get into it.
Perfect. So we're going to start. There's going to be 5 different topics here. And I'm going to give each of these guys, because just quite frankly, these guys are long-winded. I'm going to try to discipline them a little bit. But on each of these topics, I'm going to give them both 4 minutes to state their opinions, establish their positions, 4 minutes uninterrupted. I don't think this will be hard for these guys. I've given them some time to think about it. And so each will take 4 minutes, and then I'll let them rebut each other for 2 minutes uninterrupted. And then we'll just have a back and forth conversation about one of the 5 topics we're having. And so each of these 5 topics, we'll spend about 20 minutes on each of them. And so to get us started, Delano's going to go first. And so our opening question is, was Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement a force for good or a net negative for America in general and Black people in particular?
So
Now, as I said, we're not going to look too much into Delano's argument again. So he's going to argue that King and the Civil Rights Movement was a force for good. We want to look into Chad O. Jackson's arguments. That's what I want to critique, and among others, so hopefully we can start to bring more discussions and commentary on a lot of the social political arguments that's being presented in the so-called African American community. The conservatives, people like Ellis, Everett Ellis. I forget his name, but he's a conservative, and him and Chad O. Jackson have also had interviews. Vince Everett Ellis and others. I just want to critique their arguments because they argue that they're Bible. They believe the Bible, and we argue we believe the Bible. And so we are here to question their political position, and we're here to question their biblical position. And so Chad is also supposed to be a Christian. And so take note of that as we investigate this argument. The other half of the discussion, or should I say further in the discussion, because this is likely to be a series of discussions, they're going to bring in the Bible. It's going to come into play, because the argument is that Soviets and the USSR are of the devil and the powers of darkness. So we're going to address these things and bring forth some evidence to the contrary of this libel or this defamatory arguments in which is coming from especially the bourgeois or the property or those who want to be a part of the property of the bourgeois classes. Now, listen carefully to Chad O. Jackson's discussion as he presents his argument, all right? So Delano, he's going to finish up here. If you want the entire debate, God willing, it will be in the description box. But our focus is Chad O. Jackson. We have to follow some things in which he's explaining. Let's see if we can follow where he's going with it, and then to see if it's actually true or is it a false representation. So let Chad let Chad begin to present his arguments.
On race.
Delano, good opening statement. Chad, I do want to, before you go, I want to advise you, you can rebut what Delano says after you give your opening statement. So your opening statement doesn't have to be a direct rebuttal to what Delano said. Just so let me restate the question. We'll restart the clock here. Was Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement a force for good or a net negative for America in general and black people in particular?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the civil rights movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were. When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization. And by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful. Whether you're talking about in rural Arkansas, whether you're talking about in rural Oklahoma, where my folks are from, or in Texas, where I live now. When you look at this notion of what Marxism breeds in terms of exploiting grievances, as Thomas Sowell documents, as well as the late Walter E. Williams and other scholars, you saw this kind of upward mobility, this upward trajectory on the part of colored people from the 19th century well into the 1940s and 50s. And then as this kind of cultural Marxist rhetoric, this kind of feel sorry for me grievance rhetoric began to take off with the help of the press on the part of the civil rights activists, you saw the spirit of embitterness really enter colored culture, what we now call Black culture. And that has had an adverse effect on, again, not only Black culture, but also the larger American society. And I'll end by saying this. When you look at the late Nikki Giovanni, who was a poet, a radical Marxist feminist, she said in an interview with James Baldwin that Black folks in America, she acknowledged this, Black folks in America have always been successful and have always had businesses. People can look this up on YouTube right now. She said that, however, my generation, we were not good business people, we were good civil rights people. We decided to become activists. And when you look at the fact that from around that time to today, you see this kind of widening of the disparities, gaps, and so on and so forth. And you see this kind of embracing this bitterness and the spirit of entitlement that we now have. And you look at what King was saying in the 1960s, along with people like James Baldwin and others, they were really instilling the spirit of bitterness. And this was part of the kind of Soviet propaganda program that they were implementing. And so, no, it was a complete detriment to the larger American society.
We're good. Delano?
Okay, all right. We got to investigate what Mr. Jackson was bringing out. And the narrative in which he presented, I will have to argue the narrative in which he presented is pure rhetoric. Even if we work him backwards, he began to build this case that the spirit of bitterness was aroused in the so-called African American people because of the civil rights movement. the civil rights movement, he's arguing, is the catalyst for the USSR propaganda to arouse this spirit of bitterness. And this is an error. It's just to totally ignore the so-called African American history and suppression. The bitterness was always there. They just could not voice their bitterness, or else they would be brutalized. In fact, for the record, if we can look at that, Martin Luther King actually addresses this in his text, Why We Can't Wait, or you can actually find it in the you could find it in his letter in Birmingham, the letter to a letter from a Birmingham jail. And there, King is going to address this this position in which he found himself in, stuck between the affluent so-called Negro and also those who were pushed to such an edge that they wanted to inflict violence. They wanted to be violent. Why? Because it was this bitterness that they had that they just could not voice. Now, we're going to look into that letter to Birmingham, but he also said in his book, Why We Can't Wait, in chapter 2 of The Sword That Heals, it says, others believed. In fact, let us start here so we can see what Martin was explaining automatically. Now, we're going to go to the beginning, but some of the closing statements he brought out, I just want to address. So he says here, for years in the South, the white segregationists, this is what Martin is arguing. For years in the South, the white segregationist has been saying the Negro was, quote, satisfied, unquote. He has claimed we get along beautifully with our Negroes because we understand them. We only have trouble when outside agitators come in and stir it up. Martin says many expressed this point of view knowing that it was a lie of majestic proportions. Others believed they were speaking the truth. For corroboration, they would tell you. This is what the segregationists would say. They would say, quote, why, I have talked to my cook and he said, unquote. Or they would say, I discussed this frankly with the colored boy who works for us, and I told him to express himself freely, and he said, quote, unquote. So they made it, the segregationists, they made it seem like the Negro was just fine. They didn't have any grievances. Everything was just fine. They had no bitterness. This is a segregationist position. And Chad O. Jackson is actually, his undertone is presenting this segregationist position because he's saying the spirit of bitterness was aroused by the Soviet propaganda and the civil rights movement was a catalyst to cause this spirit of bitterness. And not only that, Chad argues that not only was the spirit of bitterness was aroused, but the USSR wanted to exploit grievances. And the grievances were feel sorry for me grievances. And me, in the history that I have of my grandparents coming from the South through the great migration up north, they didn't have a voice. My grandmother expressed her grievances to her grandchildren that I know of, probably told it to my aunts and uncles too, but she definitely expressed it to her grandchildren as well as our grandfather. And they didn't have a feel sorry for me grievance. Their grievance is that they were constantly robbed. Their grievance is that every time by my grandfather being a sharecropper when they would the sharecroppers would go and need food for the season, for the winter. They were always in debt. Many of them couldn't count. They was cheated, and no matter what happened, you always owed the boss, and you always had to borrow to the next season. And I remember my grandmother explaining this in frustration and expressing her grievance to us. And she said she never wanted to move back down south. She would go and visit, but she did not want to live there. Why? Because she had legitimate grievances. Her knees, both of her knees would give her trouble, debilitating trouble. And she would tell us her knees got bad, or she wore her knees out by scrubbing floor affluent families. They had grievances. They had legitimate grievances, and it wasn't a feel sorry for me grievance. So we got to address that. But as Martin is explaining, the white segregationists made it seem like everything was just fine and dandy with their Negroes, quote unquote. But this is what Martin had to say with the follow-up. White people in the South may never fully know the extent to which Negroes defended themselves and protected their jobs, and in many cases their lives, by protecting an air of ignorance and agreement. So the so-called African American in the South, which it is argued 90% of the African Americans in the country dwelt in the South at one time, they did not voice their grievances, because if they voiced their grievances, they could be brutalized. Okay? And that's what we're going to look at as we look at this association between the Soviets and the so-called African American. But no, they didn't voice their grievances. The spirit of bitterness didn't start with the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement was a platform so that now the bitterness that the so-called African American has had for centuries can be heard, because they wasn't heard. It was suppressed, violently suppressed in certain cases. Now, I would think that Chad O. Jackson would know that, but maybe he don't. So we're going to bring this out. And let's go back to the beginning of what he was arguing about the Soviets, because again, he's going to bring in the Soviets right away. He's going to bring them in right away. And he's going to begin to use trigger words: propaganda, infiltration. You know, he's going to use these words like federal expansion and stuff like that. So we want to explain what some of these things mean and see where he's actually going with this. So let's start now and listen to him again and begin to dissect some of this stuff with a fine-tooth comb. To hear out the entire debate, God willing, check the link out to Jason's Whitlock channel. You can look at the entire debate. But let us go back here. Delano, he's going to finish up, and Chad is going to come back in, and now we're going to begin to dissect this piece by piece.
On race.
Delano, good opening statement. Chad, I do want to, before you go, I want to advise you, you can rebut what Delano says after you give your opening statement. So your opening statement doesn't have to be a direct rebuttal to what Delano said. So let me restate the question. We'll restart the clock here. Was Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement a force for good or a net negative for America in general and black people in particular?
Well, the truth of the matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really, what they were a force for federal expansion.
Okay, so first he said the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King was a force for federal expansion. So again, this is segregationist and capitalist free market arguments of governmental overreach. And so he's arguing against a regulatory authority that the government will exercise in society. And to put it in perspective, governmental regulatory authority is very important. That's why you have occupational safety and health. That's why you have child labor laws, minimum wage, okay, overtime, how long a person can work before you have to pay them extra, right? All this comes from federal expansion, or as some would say in a derogatory term, governmental overreach. But we're looking at regulatory authority. So it's the same. Capitalists will argue that the government should regulate and make monopolies illegal. Why? Because they argue they wanted fairness in the market. Now, that's a whole nother argument. But nevertheless, regulatory authority is something that is necessary in a society in which everyone doesn't have the best interests of the other. So you have to bring in this regulatory authority. So the civil rights movement definitely wanted regulatory authority. Again, the civil rights movement wasn't just about sitting in the same lunch counter. The historical truth of it is that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement began to act upon the progress that was made during the Reconstruction in the 1860s. And Martin, as well as others, Philip A. Randolph and others, and the Soviets, they argued for political power for the common man. Whether people know it or not, the Soviets themselves, while they were under the reign of the Tsar, when the country was called Russia, before it became the Soviet Union, the masses of the people suffered under Jim Crow. The masses of the people suffered under police brutality. They did not have the freedom of speech. They did not have labor laws, you see. So all that we fought for here in the labor movement, where your children are not dragged out to work for the rich in the fields or in the factories at 6 and 7 years old. These were the grievances of the Soviets, and therefore they stood in solidarity with the African Americans or the Black Americans because they faced similar or the same conditions before they broke the chains of the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class or the property class. This is an important context for the Soviets. So this isn't Soviet propaganda for infiltration. That paints a totally different narrative. In fact, he used this language, the USSR propaganda. And the USSR used the civil rights movement as a strategic propaganda asset. Well, if you don't really know what propaganda means, you think it's bad. Well, everything is propaganda. Chad O. Jackson is speaking propaganda. I'm speaking propaganda. Delano is speaking propaganda. Everywhere you turn, everywhere you look, every social media site, every news channel, every commercial is propaganda. Now, propaganda just simply means the conveying of ideas. And it's important for you to know that. So yes, the Soviets used the civil rights movement as an asset, a strategic asset to convey their ideas. What ideas? Well, let's look at these ideas that they wanted to convey. And we could look at this here, for example. Now, this is the same sentiment that Chad O. Jackson have. The same sentiment not only as white segregationists, or should I say, the Southern capitalists, and many of the Southern capitalists and segregationists wore the hoods. They were part of the Ku Klux Klan. Government officials are part of the Ku Klux Klan. So when we're looking at the Ku Klux Klan, they will bear witness to the sentiment of the Soviets. Now, this is a 1940s flyer of the Ku Klux Klan. If you notice, to our right, we have Martin Luther King at the Communist Training School. And this Communist Training School is just simply the Highland Folk School for SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So I'll call it a communist school because I understand what communism is about, and I don't have a problem with communism. Our argument is that others should at least listen and understand what it means before you demonize it. But nevertheless, we're going to find out why the Ku Klux Klan demonized it. And therefore, as I said, we're looking at the Ku Klux Klan. We're looking at government officials, sheriffs, police officers. Many of them wore the Klan hood. Now, what we have here, Martin Luther King. So we will acknowledge that Chad O. Jackson, it is true what he's explaining, that the Soviets was a part of the civil rights movement. It is true that the Soviets was also in connection or training and spreading their teachings and ideas to Martin Luther King as well as others. So here in the Highlander School, we have Martin Luther King labeled as number one. Then we have Abner Berry. He's of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. That's number two. That's the brother up front with his hands on his knees and thigh. Then we have number three, Avery Williams, which is the president of the Southern Conference Educational Fund, the transmission belt in the South for the Communist Party. And then we have Miles Horton, number four, with his hands on his knee. He's the director of Highlander Folk School for the communist training. And so these men were mingling and learning the ideas of the Soviets. This is true. But let's learn the ideas of the Soviets. Now, if we go over to the Klan's flyer to our left, we see Negroes beware, do not attend communist meetings. Sound like they don't like the communists as much as Chad O. Jackson don't like the communists. I guess him and the Klan got a couple of things in common. But what else we have here is that and again, this isn't personal. I'm just critiquing the argument of Chad O. Jackson. All right. Paid organizers of the communists are only trying to get Negroes in trouble. Alabama is a good place for good Negroes to live in, but it is a bad place for Negroes who believe in what? Social equality. Now, so this teaches us that Alabama is a good place for social inequality. And if you're living in social inequality, you have a legitimate grievance. It's not a feel sorry for me grievance. It is a legitimate grievance of injustice. If you are in a society without social equality, then you can foster bitterness. However, if you decide to voice your bitterness in going against the inequality, then Alabama's not a good place for you. So this is rebutting again Chad O. Jackson's argument that the bitterness was aroused from the Soviets' propaganda to the civil rights movement. No, the bitterness was always there. But if you got the Ku Klux Klan rioting, then you're going to have a lot of the so-called African American who will suppress their bitterness. They didn't have they really wasn't didn't have accessibility to the press. All right. So whether they were being brutalized, it will stay within their communities. It really wasn't made known. And this is why when the protests started in Alabama, in Montgomery, Bull O'Connor did not want the press there. But they defied his orders and they had the press there. Because ignorance is one of the reasons why injustice could prevail. If it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And that's how the Negro bitterness was. No one knew about it because they had to suppress it. The civil rights platform gave them a platform to voice their bitterness and grievances to the world. And for Chad Jackson to say that their bitterness was conjured up by the civil rights movement by way of the propaganda of the Soviets is just simply disingenuous. That's shameful. But the Ku Klux Klan is acknowledging that the communist organizers are there for social equality. The Ku Klux Klan is watching you. Take heed. Tell the communist leaders to leave. Report all communist meetings to the Ku Klux Klan. So this is what the Soviets' ideas were: social equality. And they wanted to use the civil rights movement as a strategic propaganda asset. That is true. They wanted to use the civil rights movement strategically to convey their ideas. The civil rights movement was a strategic asset because this was a platform in which the ideas of the Soviets could be made known and the exposure of the injustices that was being inflicted upon the so-called African American or the Negro. These are the ideas that they wanted to use, all right, or convey. And this is what Chad Jackson, I believe that he should bring that out, or maybe he's not aware of it. But he's using these trigger words: propaganda, infiltration, stuff like that. Now let's go back and listen. Now, so these are the ideas. So this is true. All right. The narrative in which Chad Jackson is using and the language he's using is making it look like as a negative thing. But when we understand the Soviets wanted to stand in solidarity with the so-called African American and the civil rights movement, is because they had fought for civil rights in Russia. But that's not readily known. A lot of people might not know that the poor people, white and Asian, all throughout, because Russia is a vast territory with many ethnicities and races. And Langston Hughes, in his book, I Wonder as I Wander, he seen, according to his book, he witnessed the old signs of segregation. He bear witness that there was Jim Crow or segregation in the USSR, and it was being dismantled when the Soviets began to take over. Langston Hughes, the poet. And he have a witness, Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson went to the USSR and said for the first time he felt like a man. W.E.B. Du Bois, another witness. We have witnesses of so-called famous African Americans that brings the true or another aspect of the Soviets to show that no, it wasn't infiltration. It was solidarity because of empathy. They understood how the Negro felt because they experienced the same thing. So they decided to join hand in hand with the civil rights movement and join in solidarity with the Negro for the fight for social equality. And this social equality will have to come by regulatory authority. because the citizens themselves was not willing to practice justice. And Chad O. Jackson is saying he was against that, but he didn't call it regulatory authority. He just simply said federal expansion. So it's his words he's using to create this narrative. And I'm guilty of the same thing. The thing is, let's present the facts, though. See, he's not giving you the history of the Soviets. All right. So let's look at a couple of other things he said as we examine his arguments. All right. Let's go back and listen to a couple of other things he said.
I still have a dream.
So we're gonna pick it back up to when he began to talk about the Soviets again, and he makes mention that the Soviets used the civil rights movement as a strategic propaganda asset, which is true. It's just really understanding what that means. He's demonizing it. No, they use it as an asset to convey ideas of social justice, because this platform was now allowing the world to witness the injustices that was happening in the United States. And the Soviets also experienced it under the Tsar or under Russia. So let's look at a few more things.
The matter is that the civil rights movement and King were not a force for good. Really what they were a force for federal expansion and the USSR propaganda. The USSR, the Soviet Union, literally called the civil rights movement in America the strategic propaganda asset, because that's exactly what they were. When you look at King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, there was a direct line and an indirect line of communication between them and the Soviet Union. This goes back to the 1930s under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization, and by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement.
So again, he's using this word infiltration, but it is true. The communists and the USSR had this connection with the civil rights movement because they stood in solidarity with the African Americans who were fighting for civil rights and justice, because the Soviets experienced the same thing. So later on in our discussion, we're actually going to read arguments on the ground while it was happening, the struggle that was going on in Russia before it became the USSR, as we examine grievances that the Russian people were experiencing under the Tsar. And we're going to look at, God willing, we're going to look at Vladimir Lenin as he run down the list of grievances, what they were experiencing in 1903 and 1905. And it will seem like it was literally the South in the United States. But we'll get to that. We don't want to go too far ahead, but this helps us understand that it wasn't an infiltration like this is a bad thing. This was the Soviets standing in solidarity as friends, as a help to stand for justice for all men. So the word infiltration is just a trigger word to try to signify something bad. But no. Substitute it with solidarity. All right. So let's do.
And it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment.
So he was explaining that this the USSR connection with the civil rights movement under Philip A. Randolph, the USSR stayed in solidarity with the civil rights movement, even with King. So he's explaining it, and even through the baton being passed to Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement still had Soviet influence or solidarity, and this is true. All right. So the question to everyone who's listening, is that a bad thing? Right? So Chad O. Jackson is speaking, we're going to show you, he's speaking from the property class. Chad O. Jackson is speaking from the bourgeois. That's what the bourgeois is making reference to, the property class. Large property holders or small property holders called petty bourgeois. So this idea of libel is just simply this defamation or statements or false statements and representation of the civil rights movement. This is what we have to dissect here. So let them continue, and let's see what else we can look at for today's session.
The 1930s, under the FDR administration, where you had the National Negro Congress, which was started by a commission out of the FDR administration, and Joseph Stalin himself. A. Philip Randolph was the leader of that organization. And by the time you get to the 1960s, he would hand the baton off to Martin Luther King. And so there has always been communist infiltration in the civil rights movement, and it didn't change under Martin Luther King's leadership. I argue that this is a force for bad and is a detriment to Black Americans and to America at large, insofar that the communist ideology is antithetical to our way of life. It's antithetical to genuine success. I know Delano writes a lot about family values. He writes a lot about conventional methods and means to becoming successful. Communism is antithetical and downright hostile to those conventional means that my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents undertook to become successful.
So this is something else that it can go without saying. What is success? What is that? So you have success from the capitalist perspective, and you have success from the workers' perspective. So what is success? We have Chad arguing that the communist movement was a force for bad because he said the communist ideology is antithetical to his way of life and genuine success. What is that? This idea of being antithetical, meaning being in direct and fundamental opposition. See, we're looking at a black face. What are his values? Fundamentally, what are his values? So when he's saying our success, who is he speaking for? Is he speaking for the aristocratic class or the bourgeois class or the property class? Or is he speaking for the workers, the exploited? So that's what I mean. Race could get messy. Since he's black, when he's saying our, you think he's talking about you. But that's not what we're looking at here. You see. Just even on the back wall, we have these celebrities, or they may talk about Jordans and Oprahs and all others. And this is what Martin called tokenism. But looking at the wealth of celebrities or looking at the wealth of a small group of businessmen don't bring bread to the table of children who's hungry for the average laborer. Okay? So what fundamentals, or what are the fundamentals in which Chad O. Jackson stands? Then you could figure whether when he's saying our way of life, if he's making reference to you and me. Chad says, he argues that communism is antithetical and hostile to the conventional means that his parents and great parents undertook to become successful. What is success? Okay, well, let us look at this a bit. I want to analyze this idea of success. This success. All right. And give you an example what I mean. All right. Let's see. Now, if we go to, again, the idea that the communists want social equality, they want social equality. And when you look at who was under the hoods of the Klan, these were businessmen, they were uh, rich men, moneyed men, some of them, business owners. They will consider success different than the so-called Negro or white people who wanted social equality. But to take it further, we will argue that Chad's argument is also rooted in this type of success. And let's see if we can relate, if we making sense here. Let's go and look at the businessmen, their success. And let's see if Chad O. Jackson's bourgeois libel of the civil rights movement is so. Is it true, or is it just defamatory false statements and representation? What we have before us is the aristocratic, successful black businessmen, so-called successful. And I want to use this excerpt from Hammer and Hoe by Robin D. Kelly. In the introduction on page 3, it says, "Not all blacks toiled in the mines, mills, kitchens, and streets of Birmingham. A tiny but influential black elite established a flourishing business district along 18th Street in the heart of downtown." Now, these business districts was found in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They were found in the Carolinas. They were found sprinkled throughout the South. Business districts of black business men. And these black businessmen and moneyed black men even existed before the war. They existed during the days of slavery. Some of these black businessmen were actually slave holders. They owned slaves. All right. And so and slave owners argued that the governmental overreach was the Union Army occupying the South, and the Union Army trying to help black people through regulatory authority. Therefore, the federal expansion over the South brought forth the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment. Okay, so let's put this in perspective. Regulatory authority to go against those who's bringing out injustice. So let us get back to this success. The success of the capitalist slaver was more slaves, more land. Okay, the businessman, look at him. Now look, he says, early as 1890, the Reverend W.R. Pitterford founded and presided over Birmingham's first black bank, the Alabama Penny Savings and Loans. A lot of black people started to go into the banking business. Most of them flopped out, but a lot of them went there, as we're going to hopefully investigate through the work of E. Franklin Frazier. But it says here, and blacks and black residents often boasted of their millionaire inventor Andrew J. Beard and his railroad, mill, and farming equipment, or the affluent funeral director and insurance magnate C.M. Harris. These were businesses that a lot of black people started to make wealth off of. Funeral directors, insurance, and stuff like that. But it says black businessmen and religious leaders made their fortunes from a consumer base of working class blacks. See, their fundamentals is just their pocketbook, not the equitable justice of man, but their pocketbooks. This is the genuine success he's making reference to. We're going to follow up with this, God willing. This is the conventional means of success that his parents and grandparents undertook to become successful. These successful businessmen made their fortunes from a consumer base of working class blacks. And what else did these businessmen do? Black businessmen. They ensured peaceful relations by creating alliances with white industrialists. And a handful secured enough respectability, quote unquote, to retain the franchise. Like the white elite, they maintained their own exclusive social clubs. Oh, this was the success. The successful blacks people. They, like the white elite, they maintained their own exclusive social clubs and rarely interacted with poor blacks. This is what the successful have done. So it's important for us to understand, what do Chad O. Jackson mean by success? What does Chad O. Jackson mean by conventional means of success? And how the communists are antithetical and downright hostile to what? Their success and conventional means of success. We know that the Soviets are downright hostile to inequalities. And we're here to share that information with you. And you could take it or leave it. Because the people, white and black, Latino and Asian, we're constantly bamboozled by the aristocratic class. The aristocratic Asian really don't care too much about the poor Asian. The aristocratic Latino don't care too much about the poor Latino. The aristocratic white don't care too much about the poor white, and the aristocratic black don't care too much about the poor black. All evidence show that this isn't a race antagonism. This is a class antagonism. So when we're looking at this antithetical hostility against the fundamentals of success, yes, once we investigate it thoroughly, we're looking at the antithetical argument being against the social inequality in which the bourgeois success is founded upon. You see, and if we look at, for example, success, we're going to, God willing, examine a little bit more in the future. But if we're looking at Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier, copyright 1957, introduction, page 9, Franklin Frazier says, the presence of at least 15 million persons of Negro ancestry among the people of the United States is the outcome of expansion of Europe, which began in the 15th century and became firmly established during the succeeding 2 centuries. As the result of this expansion, Europeans met and conquered many primitive peoples, laid the basis for European settlements, and established commercial relations with the old civilizations of Asia and Africa. European expansion in the Americas became especially important for the economic development of Europe, since the production of tobacco, sugar, and cotton, which were exchanged for European manufactures, increased world trade and brought untold wealth to Europe. Success on the backs of who? The laborers, indentured whites, enslaved blacks, indentured Asians, exploited Latinos, enslaved indigenous Indians of the land. So when we're looking at success and conventional success, what are you making reference to? The Soviet is anti-exploitation. And again, exploitation just simply means to make use of. First definition. Second definition, exploitation is to make use of for one's own personal means and gains. So when we say the exploitation of the working class, the working class are being robbed to enrich the business class. And this business class made untold fortunes throughout the world. Fraser continues, for the production of these raw materials and articles of commerce, Negro slaves were transported to the New World and became the main support of the triangular trade involving the metropolis, Africa, and the colonies. Negro slaves thus became the creators of the wealth that made the flowering of capitalism possible in the 19th century. So, as we discussed before in other podcasts, the senators in 1850 was arguing that that slavery was a great evil to the body politic, but it was an inexorable necessity. Something that just could not be taken away. Why? Because the wealth of the nation depended upon the exploitation of labor. All this must be taken into account as we analyze Chad O. Jackson's arguments. We must realize what are the conventional means in which Chad O. Jackson is making reference to. And then we could juxtapose it with the Soviets when we understand their history. And God willing, we're going to start to bring this out. And hopefully we could begin to see how just because a person is of your same race, whatever that is, that doesn't mean that they're your brother. You may have fundamental differences. And so we find that these black businessmen exploited and also made themselves untouchable to the poor blacks. All right. And this is one of the reasons why segregation was a problem for them, because the black businessmen monopolized the black dollar. Because of segregation, black people couldn't spend their money with no one else. Thus, the black businessmen made fortunes because they had a monopoly of the black dollar. So segregation was a problem for them. And we'll close with this. This is exactly what Martin was explaining in the letter from Birmingham that I made mention of earlier. The letter from Birmingham jail, when he was explaining how he stood between two forces. Page 100 in the text, Why We Can't Wait. And this is the chapter 5, letter from Birmingham jail. He explains, he said, I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency, made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation, and in part of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problem of the masses. So we have two things we learn here. Martin is explaining the bitterness and the grievance of being oppressed in the South and how it had beat many of the Negroes down. So it wasn't this sense of bitterness that arose because of the Soviets. No, it was a bitterness and grievance that was already there. And we're not looking at they feel sorry for me grievance. That is just an insult. But we also find, as Martin says, we have in part a few middle class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation or the monopolizing of the black dollar, black people couldn't spend nowhere else. In some ways they profit by segregation. They have become insensitive to the problem of the masses. So we're going to look at this, all right? And then he says the other force is one of bitterness and hatred. And it comes because, or it comes by way of the advocating of violence. All right. So we see bitterness there, suppression there, but we also see we have middle class or so-called upper class Negroes who benefit off segregation. They have economic security and education, and they also are insensitive to the plight of the masses. This is what it sounds like Chad O. Jackson. He's speaking in their behalf. They have become insensitive to the plight of the masses. And so therefore, they run on this argument because they're insensitive. They're saying, well, you know, they're running off all these Negroes have this feel sorry for me grievance. That is a smack in the face. But we got to follow up with this discussion and with this debate as we analyze Chad O. Jackson's argument. And I'm arguing that it is libel or just defamatory statements, misrepresentations of Martin, the Soviets, and also the civil rights movement. I'd like to thank all of you who have taken the time out to listen to our podcast today. Most High willing, we'll pick it up a little later in our next session so we could continue to look at the critique of Chad O. Jackson's argument. And again, I am your host, Brother Judah, here on What Is to Be Done. And continue with us as we investigate geopolitical, historical, biblical, social, and other scientific content. And for all of the listeners who are sincerely searching, we pray that the Almighty bless your understanding. And for all of you who are sincerely searching, we say, all of you who have an ear, let them hear.